Reading Aloud, Lectores and Roman Reading by Raymond J. Starr. Lectores, specialists in oral reading, played a vital role in aristocratic Romans' experience of literature, although they have received very little scholarly attention. Roman society was not, of course, an oral society in the sense in which anthropologists use the term. Roman literature is profoundly dependent on books and access to them by both writers and readers. Catullus complains from Verona, for instance, that he is restricted in composing because he has brought only one small box of books with him from Rome. But when the Romans read literary texts, they normally read them out loud. The Romans also often composed orally by dictating. Although Quintilian objected to dictation because he felt it leaves no time for measured reflection, and because a slow secretary causes problems, dictation became so common that dictare came virtually to mean to compose as well as to dictate. The Romans largely confined silent reading to documentary material and generally to writings in which content was paramount and style of little or no importance, although even business or research reading might be done out loud. On occasion, even literary works were read silently, although this seems generally to have happened only in special cases. In his 4th century CE rhetorical handbook, Cicidius Fortunatianus recommends, "Before we begin to write, so that the mind may grow warm through reading, let us read something silently or with a faint murmur." He specifies silent reading to make his recommendation clear, since his audience would normally assume oral reading, even though this is only a warm-up. Cicero apparently read lyric poetry in silence, since he remarks, "If songs by chance delight the deaf, they ought first to consider that, before these were invented, many wise men live happily. Then that much greater pleasure can be derived from reading them than from hearing them." This does not represent Cicero's standard practice with all literature, however. He simply did not care for lyric poetry. Roman literature, then, might more accurately be described as oral than as oral. Literature was appreciated primarily through the ears rather than the eyes. When Pliny compliments the voce suavissima of Piso, or Juvenal complains about the epic poet Cordus, whom he called raucus, a word Ovid applies to the sounds of frogs and asses. The voice and the poetry are not easily separable. The experience of the poem was also the experience of the reader's voice. Donatus reports that the poet Julius Montanus used to say that he would steal certain things from Virgil if only he could take his voice, face, and delivery as well. For the same verses, when pronounced by Virgil himself, sounded good, but without him they were empty and mute. A reading that brought out the metrical effects of a poem, or the rhythmical play of an oration or history, would require a talented reader, whose skills were kept sharp by regular, frequent practice, as we can see when Ausonius urges his grandson to use the inflection of his voice to render, with learned accents, the flexible meters of comedy. So basic was reading aloud that a wealthy Roman's household staff might well include a lector. Some Romans have several lectores. During a court case against Crassus, Brutus used 2 lectores, one of whom read an oration of Crassus, the other the Servilian law, for which Crassus had spoken, and thus revealed the contradiction in Crassus's spoken views. Crassus, however, retaliated with 3 lectores to humorous but damaging effect. Pliny, writing from one of his country estates, says the slaves he brought from Rome are supervising the harvest, while they left me with my secretaries and readers. Lectores were slaves or freed slaves, as was the rest of the support staff for literary activity and research, note-takers, clerks, copyists. Most lectores were probably male, although inscriptions reveal some female readers. Some might be vernae, and perhaps even educated at home, as were those of Atticus, although his standards were probably unusually high. Certain periods, exempli gratia wartime, might yield slaves who were freeborn and had been educated before being enslaved, but it was also possible to buy slaves who had been trained for particular duties specifically for sale. It seems clear that clerically trained slaves could be purchased, and reasonable to imagine a small but steady market for lectores, who would have been comparatively expensive. Lectores usually read literary texts or in context related to literature or literary work. Since there are no recorded cases of a master having one lector for Greek and another for Latin, and since many Roman aristocrats read both languages, it is probably safe to assume that many lectores read both languages. Lectores were not the only servants, whether slaves or freedmen, who read to their masters, although they probably did all the literary reading under normal circumstances. A secretary, a manu, a clerk, librarius, or some other slave probably did most of the purely secretarial reading. Atticus's letters, for instance, are read to Cicero by an unspecified slave. A note-taker, notarius, read to the elder Pliny when the carriage would not hold both a notarius and a lector. Although the interpretation is necessarily tentative, this passage may show how specialized lectores were. A notarius would take notes and, if necessary, read aloud, but the lector would be expected only to read aloud. A brief survey will suggest how versatile lectores were. First, since their specialized abilities might improve the quality of the performance, they sometimes read aloud their master's work at private recitations, although we do not know how commonly. After Pliny had recited his poetry on at least 2 occasions, he asked his friend Suetonius for advice. Pliny has heard that he reads poetry badly, and so is considering using one of his freedmen to read for him at a gathering of his close friends. "This too is common practice," he says, "that I have chosen someone who will read not well, but better, if however he is not disturbed, for he is as new to being a reader as I am to being a poet." Pliny does not, however, even think of using his lector to read his speeches, since he recited them himself. If an author used the lector, he often was still involved in the presentation. Pliny goes on to ask Suetonius, "I myself don't know what I will do meanwhile while he is reading, whether I should sit fixed and silent, similar to someone at leisure, or, as some do, follow what he pronounces with murmur, eyes, and hand. But I think that I dance no less poorly than I read." The phrase, "as some do," shows the absence of a standard practice. Some people let the reader handle the entire presentation, while others used him or her merely for the sound, while they provided the visual effects, as it were. Second, they assisted their masters in literary work. This use of lectores was probably extremely common, although it has left comparatively few traces in the surviving sources. The orator Crassus made frequent use of his scripture et lectore diffilus. While Cicero was staying at his Tusculan villa, a lector, I suspect, read aloud the draft of part of the De Republica to Cicero and Sallustius, who suggested improvements. Third, lectores routinely handled various kinds of pleasure and entertainment reading. They read for their master's private enjoyment. For instance, Marius enjoyed himself at Stabiae, listening to his lector Protigenes, while Fronto imagines that he would find M. Aurelius, who had withdrawn to Alcium to relax, listening to his lector Niger, read Plautus, Axius, Lucretius, Ennius, or Cicero. Lectores also read for the entertainment of both master and guests, although the surviving evidence is not all we might wish. For example, although a lector is not specifically mentioned, it is easy to suppose that Pliny's elderly friend Spurina made frequent use of a lector as he passed the days of his retirement in what Pliny thought a delightful routine. After staying in bed until after dawn, Spurina takes a walk, and he exercises his mind no less than his body. If friends are present, most honorable conversations unfold. If not, a book is read, sometimes even when friends are present, if they don't mind. Then he sits, and again a book or conversation preferable to a book. Lectores also handled the readings at dinner parties, one of the most popular and simplest dinner party entertainments among the aristocracy. Readings were the sole entertainment only at comparatively informal parties, since as the formality of the meal increased, so did the elaborateness of the entertainment. Atticus apparently had no other entertainments than readings at any dinner he gave. Nepos thought Atticus's practice was delightful, but he implies that it was extreme. Cicero sent to Atticus his essay on glory with specific instructions. Let the two selections be marked which Salvius, when he has found good listeners, may read, but only at a dinner party. When Pliny withdrew from Rome to his estate in Tuscany in the summer or in Laurentum in winter, a book was typically read during the evening meal if he was dining with only his wife or a few people. The meal was followed by a comedy or a lyre player, although in winter the press of business might force Pliny to forego the after-dinner entertainment and return to work. Pliny considered one type of entertainment sufficient, since he tells Septicius Clarus, who, the orator facetiously complains, skipped dinner at Pliny's to go to a fancy banquet elsewhere, that you would have heard comedians or a reader or a lyre player, or such is my generosity, all of them, how much we would have played, laughed, and studied. You can dine more elaborately at many houses, but nowhere more cheerfully, simply, or freely. Gellius tells us that his friend, the philosopher Favorinus, customarily had a reading at a familiar gathering, and in another scene clearly indicates the use of a lector to do the reading. At a dinner with the philosopher Favorinus, when we had reclined at the table, and a dish was beginning to be served, a slave standing by his table would begin to read either something from Greek literature or from our own, just as on that day when I was present, a book by Gavius Bassus, a learned man, concerning the origins of words and terms was being read. The use of a lector was not absolutely required at the dinner party, but Romans clearly felt that a lector marked the events of a certain social class. The speaker in Juvenal's 11th satire defensively draws attention to his lack of a professional lector to read the Virgil and Homer at his small and simple dinner party. In some upper-class groups, however, lectores and their readings were considered dull and stupid. Personal taste was the final arbiter for both host and guest, and both might need to exercise tact. Pliny's friend Janitor was offended by the buffoons, effeminates, and fools at what he admitted was an extremely elegant dinner, but Pliny has no sympathy for him. Indeed, I have nothing of that sort, yet I tolerate those who do. And indeed, how many people do you think there are who are offended by the things that capture and attract you and me, partly as silly, partly as most annoying? How many, when a reader or lyre player or comedian is brought in, ask for their shoes, or recline with no less disgust than you endure those monstrosities? Finally, lectores read to their masters in many of the miscellaneous situations where we today might pick up a book and read to ourselves. Many of these situations, however, are invisible to us, since our sources usually do not provide this kind of detail. For example, only Suetonius's omnivorous curiosity preserves the detail that the Emperor Augustus had lectores read to him if he woke during the night, and that he would then go back to sleep and frequently slept longer than usual. The elder Pliny had a book read and notes taken during meals, even when guests were present, and a lector also read aloud during his sunbaths, and even while he was being rubbed down after his bath. As this survey suggests, the master and his lector were in constant contact. Even when the master traveled, his lector often accompanied him. Although it is always dangerous to take what might be a naively benign view of the master-slave relationship, this continual contact may often have led to warm affection. Cicero tells Atticus, "By Hercules, I was rather disturbed in my writing, for a delightful boy, our reader Sositheus, had died, and had moved me more than the death of a slave seemed proper." The younger Pliny calls his ill lector Encolpius, "He who serves my serious pursuits, he who is my delight." He also unstintingly praises both the accomplishments and the character of his freedman Zosimus when the latter is sick, and emphasizes how many and how pleasant services Zosimus performs. Lectores were more than a luxury. They made it possible for their masters to listen to a work read at many times when that would have been awkward or impossible otherwise, as the elder Pliny's regime suggests. Since one read a roll by rolling it from the right to the left hand, reading required two hands, but that inconvenience was completely circumvented by the use of a lector. Lectores might also serve the function of modern eyeglasses. A master whose eyesight had deteriorated with age might still enjoy reading in much the same way he had earlier. But lectores had another function, perhaps even more basic and much easier to overlook. They made it possible for their masters to enjoy literary texts without having to read a hand-copied roll. The person listening to a lector read was not encumbered by the no doubt sometimes laborious task of deciphering the text, often devoid of almost all readers' aids.